Hello, hello, and welcome again to a Beatles program, a weekly talk show podcast called Things We Said Today. This is a show in which we talk about anything that has to do with the Beatles, their past, the present, sometimes the future, any aspect of their careers, their music, their history, you name it. Whatever comes to mind. I'm Ken Michaels. I'm one of the three regular co-hosts of this show, also known for my other Beatles program, a syndicated radio show called Every Little Thing. And I'm being joined by my two regulars, first of all, contributing writer for Billboard magazine, also for Variety, Access.com, that's AXS.com, Hollywood Reporter. That's just to name a few. He's also the author of the book Meet a Monkey, Davy Jones, and that's Steve Marinucci. Hi, Steve.
Hi, Ken. Hello, everyone.
And also our other regular co-host is a former writer for the New York Times in their classical department. He's our resident musicologist. Also the author of The Beatles from the Cavern to the Rooftop and the recent ebook, Got That Something? How the Beatles, I Want to Hold Your Hand Changed Everything. And that's our very own Alan Kozin. Hi, Alan.
Hello, Ken. Hello, everyone.
And we do have a special guest on the show this time out, and we will introduce him in just a few moments. But first, we want to get to a couple of news items. First of all, we have some very sad news, another major passing in the rock world, that being Ray Thomas of the Moody Blues. And you'd know him for all the wonderful flute playing that he did with the Moodies. He was also a great songwriter in the group. Known for a few songs like For My Lady, which is one of my favorite Moody Blues songs, and Legend of a Mind, to name a few. And very sad news, he was one of the founding members of the Moody Blues, along with Denny Laine and Mike Pinder. Guys, you want to comment about this at all? How about we'll start with you, Alan?
I really don't have a lot to say. I was never a huge Moody Blues fan, actually. So,
that's kind of surprising to me, in a way.
Yeah?
I mean, the Moody's blended rock with classical music, classical elements, and, you know, you're being a lover of classical music, so I would think...
Yes, but...
I'm serious,
things don't necessarily always work that way, but, I mean, I like the Moody Blues okay. I just was never a big fan of the stuff, and, I mean, I have it all, don't listen to it. But, yeah, you know, so I will just defer to you and Steve.
Okay. How about you, Steve?
Well, I also was not a huge Moody Blues fan, but I did listen to them a lot. And, you know, it's especially on the fact that they're getting inducted into the Rock Hall of Fame. It's too bad that he's not going to be part of that. At least he knew, you know, at least he got to find out about it, but it's too bad he won't be there for the ceremony. But I mean, you know, those early Moody Blues albums are just, you know, are part of. I don't know. It's hard to say. It's hard to put it in words. I mean, they're really part of. They were part of our. You know, like you could almost parallel it to Tom Petty in the, you know, for the young generation here. With the Moody Blues then, you know, they were huge, and FM radio played them a ton. Nights in White Satin, Question, you know, I mean all those songs, you know. So it's very sad. It's too bad. I had not heard that he was ill. It's, you know, anytime you hear about these things and you haven't heard that they're ill or anything, you just kind of go, yikes. And that's really what happened here, because, you know, I wasn't aware that he was ill. And
neither was I.
And then to hear that, it's really sad. But our condolences to his family and his fans. I mean, God, it's just too bad it had to happen on the verge of them getting put into the Rock Hall. But
yeah. Don't you just hate when that happens right before the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame ceremonies? It's kind of like the two members of the Dave Clark Five, you know.
Well, that's the worst thing. I mean, that's really bad there. But again, at least Ray knew what was coming, so you know that's a good thing.
Yeah. Well, from my perspective, you know, I love the Moody Blues, and that flute playing from Ray Thomas is just so much a part of so many of the classic songs like Nights in White Satin and Tuesday Afternoon. Those songs, Isn't Life Strange? It's such a beautiful part of the songs themselves. And, the Moody Blues are a band that I really appreciate because they're one of the few. It's a small percentage of bands that are out there where every single member actually contributes as songwriters. And that certainly was the case from the Justin Hayward, John Lodge years on. Every single member wrote something, and every member except Graham Edge would sing lead vocals. So it was so much more of a group effort in many ways in that regard. And there's so few bands you could say that about. And the Moody Blues do have some connections there with the Beatles. Obviously, Denny Laine joining Wings, and Mike Pinder was said to have introduced the Mellotron to John Lennon, and he also played on a few songs on the Imagine album. Plus, I was reminded right after we heard the news about Ray Thomas that back in 1986 there was a concert that was held in Birmingham, and it was for a children's hospital. This was a charity show, which was put together by Bev Bevan of ELO, and he actually got the Moody Blues to perform, and he also got ELO to reunite for the show. Robert Plant also performed, and as a special guest at the very end, to everyone's surprise, was George Harrison. And George came out on stage, and I'm not sure if he sang lead or not, but they did Money on stage, and they also did Johnny Be Good. And there is a photo that's now online, which I believe I have on my Facebook page, which shows the Moody Blues with Ray Thomas there, with George Harrison on stage. So it was really nice that George played a part in that. And, obviously the Bev Bevan Jeff Lynne connection right there. And because of Jeff Lynne, that's the reason why George was a part of that show. So very sad news about Ray Thomas. And, like we said, condolences to the Moody Blues fans and to the Moody Blues themselves and their families. And the other bit of news that we have concerns the sales of vinyl albums. For 2017, the Beatles actually had the top 2 best-selling albums of last year, with Sgt. Pepper leading the way, no doubt because of the release, the 50th anniversary and all. 72,000 copies were sold, and Abbey Road was in second place at 66,000. So that's pretty impressive. And the sale of vinyl albums apparently are continuing to rise with every year. So very good sign right there to show the demand for the Beatles on vinyl. Alan?
Well, I guess it's impressive that, given that a lot of vinyl sales these days are actually young collectors who are into very different things. Daft Punk was a big vinyl album in its time too, and so it is kind of impressive that, given that that's the market, that the Beatles are up there at the top of the list.
Steve, how about you?
I think Abbey Road's been a perennial good seller. It's on the charts, a lot for vinyl sales, so that's not that surprising. Pepper, though, obviously, obviously it was because of the reissue, is a good surprise. But Abbey Road is there, and I'm trying to remember if Pepper is, but obviously the reissue boosted Pepper. So, but that's
whenever the Beatles appear on the charts in any way, it always tends to be their later albums that reappear the most. So it tends to be Sgt. Pepper or the White Album or Abbey Road.
Or one,
yes.
One is, one is like is almost like Dark Side of the Moon, where it's on there a lot. So
that's true. Anyway. All right, so we're happy to hear that news. So right now, why don't we welcome our special guest? One particular book, actually, there's 3 that we're going to mention. That's been a big part of our lives. Was a discography called All Together Now. And it was written by 2 gentlemen, Harry Castleman, and our special guest on today's show, Wally Podrazik. This was, to me, one of the most indispensable books ever for a Beatle fan, and it's probably the most worn-out book I have in my Beatles collection because I've used it so much for information And for news and for trivia, I always go back to these three books. But it is without a doubt one of the most essential books, as are all three of the books that we're going to talk about. And Wally Podrazik is here. Thank you not only for putting together these books, but for being a special guest on today's show. Hi, Wally.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation. I dug out my copies, both the hardcover of the Altogether Now, The Beatles Again, and The End of the Beatles. And also I dug out my paperback copy of Altogether Now, because so often I hear from, just like what you said, it's so worn out, and holding it together with tape and all. Well, I'm looking at my copy, and it's so worn out, held together with tape, because I used it just as often as you did, just as my own reference. Mm-hmm. In fact, that was the reason that Harry Castleman and I did the book in the first place. And the name Altogether Now really was a description of, look, we need to get all the notes that we have scattered over our notebooks in the pre-computer age and put it into one place that we can find what we want to find. And so, thus, Altogether Now. And if I may just give a little bit of background, we did that when we were in Washington, D.C., living on the East Coast with obviously easy access to New York. So basically, we did a computer database research book before there was a computer database research world to be able to tap. So our computer database was the National Archives and the Library of Congress, supplemented by trips up to New York to the Lincoln Center branch of the New York Public Library Rodgers and Hammerstein collection. Mm-hmm. And when you combine those forces along with the various record collector associates we met along the way, and obviously looking at literature that had already been published, such as the Beatles books, but not yet the reprints. So we had to go to the original Beatles books printings and just call them for information that helped fill out what we already had in our notes. Let's say we were 80% of the way there, but then a concentrated period of, I'd say about 5 months of intense research in the D.C., New York area is what brought us to the completed version. And we were very proud of putting that all together now. Then.
Now, just so our listeners know, in case they're not familiar with your books, but I'll talk specifically about Altogether Now.
Sure.
What makes this book so special is that, first of all, you include the releases of Beatles and solo Beatle music up through 1975. You have the U.S. releases, you have the UK releases, and this includes everything, including EPs. Mm-hmm. And then on top of all that, you have the releases that were on Apple Records when they came out. You had side projects of the Beatles. If one of the Beatles wrote a song for someone else or plays on it or produced it, it's in the book. The songs they wrote for others. You also have a chapter on the songs that they covered as a band and in their solo careers and who the original artists were and when those records came out. You know, there's so much in there, plus chart information from Billboard magazine and also in the UK on the British charts. So yeah, how did you go about making it so comprehensive? What was the thought in all of that?
The thought in all of that was, what did we want to know? What did we want to have handy? And probably the thing I'm most proud of for the approach we took was the Beatles, what we call for others and from others. The from others obviously is the influences, and that in itself was a delightful research project because you had things like Ringo Starr's Sentimental Journey album, which meant when you were going from others, you were going back to the beginning of the 20th century to find the roots of some of those songs. And the for others was also delightful because it basically said, look, the Beatles could play as individuals and as a group, but mostly individuals, even back in the mid-'60s. They could decide to hang out with whomever they wanted. This is who they chose to hang out with. And we thought that that was a pretty important story to understand what it is that was going on with the Beatles musically. What caught their fancy? What did they decide to? With whom did they decide to spend studio time, production time, or earmark a song for someone to do? And I think it was taking that wide approach, both the from others and for others, that made us better appreciate the Beatles as, well, not just pop culture force, musical force. It forces you to get out of the box of saying it's rock and roll. Well, it's rock and roll, it's country and western, and it's rhythm and blues. It's show tunes. It's basic. It's Louis Armstrong. It's going back to that era. It's going back to Bing Crosby. And when you have that context, then when someone like a George Harrison comes out and does True Love, it makes sense because it's part of the music that they grew up on, that they embraced, that they were interested in. And so that's what we were trying to convey, is that, yeah, it's wonderful to have the Beatles canon. We were just saying that the Beatles canon could include so much more. And on the way to gathering those discs, you will expose yourself to far more aspects of music than you ever imagined that you could. I mean, how else would we have backed into David Bromberg, for instance, except with a George Harrison connection on the first album? Now, once Harry and I listened to the first album, we became big David Bromberg fans. But the fact is that the George Harrison hook is what got you there. And yes, I know you could have done a Bob Dylan hook and other hooks, but I'm saying that George Harrison got our attention. That was the flag. And one other thing about how we immersed ourselves in it, I mentioned the Library of Congress. The Library of Congress had, not because of the Beatles, but because it was the Library of Congress, had bound back issues of New Musical Express and, Billboard, obviously, but I'm looking at the British, Melody Maker, Disc Weekly and all, with Melody Maker and New Musical Express being the most complete collections, going back to the 20s. So it's not like they started this because of the Beatles. They started it because they were a music reporting news publications. And those not only gave us lots of bits of trivia, which hadn't yet been mined, again, pre-internet world, but also gave us the context. It gave us the sense of where they were coming from, what they would have grown up on, what they would have, because we started in the late 50s, basically mid to late 50s, reading every issue, just looking for anything that would help inform the story. Obviously, when you get to the Beatles have broken out in Great Britain, sometimes the whole issue would generate pages of notes. But even in the old days, there was that one moment we were looking at Elvis is coming to England. Elvis is coming to England. Elvis is coming to England. That was the rumor that was always there. And at one point, we turned to each other and said, "He's never coming." This is a story that's unfolding. We know how it ends, but because it's real-time news reporting, they don't know how it ends. So they're going to give the perspective of the time, and that really helped. I'll give you one more snapshot. We then, at each day's worth of research, we would go back to an office area we were using and listen to what was then pretty definitive British BBC. I think it was a 12-part history of the Beatles. And we would listen to the year that we were just researching. And at one point during the coverage of 1964 in the U.S., we turned to each other without thinking and said, "Those Americans are so silly," because we had gotten ourselves so immersed in the British point of view, the British perspective, their British journey. So that really helped to better inform understanding the U.S. because we had already seen what they did from nothing to something in Great Britain. It was a way of excitedly gathering all of the information that we wanted to have in place and putting it in a form that we hoped people would enjoy and share. And I'll tell you, I would be watching people in bookstores and all, flipping through and seeing what are they looking at? What is it that they find interesting? And they would be looking at titles and lists and pictures. So I went, all right, we did what we were supposed to do, and people like it. That was a long answer to your question. Sorry about that.
Well, there's so many reasons to appreciate Altogether now, and just want to thank you for what you said about the influences, because the biggest reason why the Beatles are so varied in their catalog, group and solo, is because they did have so many influences, and like you said, Wally, even pre-rock and roll. You could even go back to Beautiful Dreamer.
Oh, yeah.
Stephen Foster, and that was written in the 1800s, the 1850s, I think. So, and because of your book, we began to understand a lot of this stuff. But, and I also want to thank you because whenever I would go to local record stores that had rare material, and certainly at the Fest for Beatle Fans, for many years, before we had the internet, I would try to hunt down a lot of these side projects. Where is this song called 4th of July that Paul McCartney wrote for John Christie? I never heard of it before. And certain songs like that. And if it wasn't for Altogether now, I wouldn't even know about a lot of those songs. Anyway.
Well, and actually, another influence on us is Harry Castleman and I worked at the college radio station at Northwestern, WNUR, at the perfect time to be a Beatles fan. It was the early 70s, so you had that whole rush of solo material that was coming out, which people loved and was very successful. And we were the resident Beatles experts. So we got first dibs on everything that came into the radio station because, of course, Harry and Wally have to see this. And so you mentioned 4th of July in particular. Well, if you were at a radio station, there was no doubt where it came from because you got the promo package, which was touting it, saying, Paul McCartney wrote it, John Christie sang it, here's the 4th of July. And you're going, oh, okay, great. I don't know if I would have found it in a I wouldn't have found it in a record store, but it came in the mail in a plain brown package with every other record release that was going to the radio station. So that was a tremendous help for us in terms of finding things that would have been off the radar because everything would come through the mail transit.
Yeah, well, I know that my local radio never played 4th of July, so I never would have heard that song or known about it probably up until that point if it wasn't for your book. Anyway, why don't we let my other co-host speak? Alan, you have a question for Wally?
Sure. A lot of questions, actually. Before we went on the air, in fact, before you turned up, we were talking a little bit about the publishing history of this, and I had always assumed, and perhaps wrongly, that the paperback version had come out first. I mean, that was the one that was plentifully available everywhere, and that the hardback came later. But is it the other way around?
Oh, definitely was the other way around. We contracted with a small publisher in Ypsilanti, Michigan, Ann Arbor, Michigan.
So that was Purian Press?
Purian Press. And frankly, it was our first book. So we had sent query letters throughout the checklist of potential publishers, and they were the ones that said, this sounds intriguing. Went to the Library of Congress to look at other things they published, and I came back to tell Harry, I think we're going to be fine. They do lists. They do books of lists. So I think that's why they said this has potential to be interesting. And then God bless the editor there, a guy by the name of Tom Schultheis, right. who kept pushing us to say, well, can you put a little more in there? Could you put a little more in there? Try look. Do you want to do this list too? Put that list in. Until finally he said, okay, enough. We need to get this thing published. But it was that version that then was licensed to Ballantine Books. And that was another example of perfect timing in that Ballantine looked and saw, oh, Paul McCartney has just demonstrated in his 1976 tour that there is still interest in things Beatle. Sure, we'd like to put a bid in on that. And so that's what gave it its massive distribution. And that's the version that most people know. But that's the only one that went paperback.
Right.
But all three of them were hardcover editions. And the second one just took a very short period of time, 76 and 77. Mm-hmm. And then the final one, The End of the Beatles, took it to about
85, I think it was published.
Yeah. We kind of cheated a little, pushed it, and it was the mid-'80s. And the final volume, we actually cut out about 110 typeset pages because he said, I'm not going to publish a 700-page book. And so, yeah, I know. We had a whole expanded section on video back then, more about British Ringo records, things like that. And he said, let's wait on that. And we never did get back to doing the Beatles stuff with them. And then by that time, our parallel interest, the book Watching TV, had gotten our attention and our focus, and that was a season-by-season history of television, which was equally immersive. Remember I said for the Altogether Now, we plunged into all the information that we could find about, especially British news sources. Well, take that and apply it to all of American television, and you've got afterwards, I said to Harry, why do we always choose projects like this? Why can't we do something we can knock out in maybe a month? But that was in our bones. We had to do it that way. If you do get the third volume, The End of the Beatles, you will find how deeply we can go. We've got the Four Bucketeers in there, which is a spin-off of a spin-off of a spin-off of a eventually leads you back to the Beatles, but it was like, well, while we're here, why don't we look at what else these Mike McCartney and Roger McGough and all, what else they were involved in. So we started going into a lot of sidebars, which was fun. But
well, in the third volume also has a pretty expansive BBC section, which is kind of interesting.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
In fact, what we did is Mark Lewison had published his articles about BBC tracks, and we looked at it and said, there's one thing missing, an index to it. And so we, with his permission, I said, Mark, this is what we're going to do. And he said, that's fine with me. And so we did an index guide, an annotated guide to our series of articles that he had done for the Beatles book, reprint series, but in the new section. So,
yeah. I mean, the first one came out actually well before Mark had started working on anything at all, and it actually was a really interesting time to be writing a thing like this, because there were no Beatles research books really to speak of. I mean, there were some biographies, a bunch of biographies, Hunter Davies and some sort of cut and paste things, but no one had really brought all this stuff together the way you had, and to go on, for 3 volumes, over a decade, really was extremely handy, and Period Press, I think, generally speaking, was that way. I mean, they put out a lot of really good Beatles research books.
Oh yeah. They did something called Every Little Thing. In fact, they did a series of reprints as well. Right. Like they contracted with Derek Taylor to do a reprint of his book and Longest Cocktail Party and the DeLillo. So sort of taking parallel, it was like they did something called the Literary Lenin, which was literally that. It was a guide to writings by and about John Lennon. And one of my favorite non-Harry and Wally books, the collection of the Beatles lyrics, again, indexed by word.
Yeah,
yes.
It's basically
I love that
book. Yeah.
A concordance, yes, thank you. And if you want to know, well, what song had the word diamonds in it, well, you're going to find it there. If you want to see tit, 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 that you've got that indexed in there. And in fact, the only thing that was disappointing, but the authors of that had chosen the purity of their path, is if the Beatles did a cover version, they didn't they didn't want to pursue all the publishing nightmares they'd have to go through to reproduce those lyrics. As it was, they had permission to do the Beatles material, which included George Harrison authored and Ringo Starr authored and Lennon McCartney authored, and they put all that in that volume, and I use it all the time.
Yeah. What were you guys doing elsewhere in your life at the time you put this together? You said you were at Northwestern and then you went to Washington. Now you're back in Chicago. So what brought you both to Washington?
In Washington, again, let's get the era. We were working at the Democratic National Committee offices, and so that was our day job. And we worked on things like they had fundraising telethons, and we were in the city when Richard Nixon resigned. So we were working on what they called the radio and TV news service. This is back when there were radio stations that had their own news departments in much greater number than is true now. And so that we would call them with audio clips of Democratic senators, congressional leaders, and such, and say, would you be interested in these comments that Senator Humphrey offered on a budget deal or offered on the international situation? And so we would have pre-cut 30-second clips that we would feed over the telephone lines to individual radio station news departments, who could then pick it up and use as much or as little as they cared to. But it was us saying, see, we're making it so convenient for you to have these voices in your newscast. And they could say, Senator Humphrey said such and such, and if they credited us, great. If they didn't, we didn't care, because we just wanted to get Senator Humphrey's words out. So, and then that eventually led to, I ended up working on the political conventions, which is quadrennial. But I ended up working on the political convention, starting with the 1976 New York Democratic National Convention, and that came directly out of that. So we were doing other. Oh, and then Harry went and became a lawyer.
I was wondering what became of Harry. So the other thing, just flipping through these again this afternoon. You have sections on bootlegs, which was sort of a semi-new industry at the time the first one came out. I mean, I think bootlegs hadn't really been out for more than 5 years or so by then.
Right, yeah.
So how did you decide, how to even handle those, since they were, let's say dubiously legal, actually totally illegal?
No, they weren't legal at all. But what we decided is to treat them or sort them by source as opposed to disc, because it would have been a nightmare, mostly. It would have been a nightmare to say, well, here's this version versus that version versus that version of the tracks. Instead, we said, let's see if we could figure out where some of this came from and sort it chronologically that way. In some cases, we got it wrong, and in most cases, we got it right. And we never considered them real releases. So that freed us from the self-imposed requirements of, well, what was the release date? What's the best pressing? What's the track order? Well, who cares? Because actually, the way we got most of that material is we were amongst fandom folks. And we had, through the kind generosity of collectors that we knew going back to our Northwestern days, all the way through to the actual formal research out of D.C., and we just recorded everything. They let us say, here, you want to borrow this stack of records? Sure. Went through, recorded them all. Went through another set, recorded them all. and then we came back, and therefore we had already gone one step away from them being discs. They were just tracks out there. So then we decided, well, let's start dealing with what are the interesting tracks here. And so what we like to say is they were rare imported discs that, and just leave it out. That was the euphemism of the time, I guess. This is a rare import.
It's sort of the equivalent of Paul McCartney's herbal cigarettes.
Sort of, yeah. And it was just funny because once you've gone 2 steps removed from it, you focus totally on how good does this sound, and in most cases it sounded awful. The exceptions, of course, being, and this now hits more volume 2, the Beatles again, would have been the Decca tapes, which excited us no end, because finally here are the tracks, and then good quality BBC material starting to hit the bootleg circle as well, and so those we treated a little bit more like albums because they were things that you actually wouldn't be embarrassed to put on your turntable and have a non-Beatles fanatic listen to. The BBC stuff especially. Though I do remember bringing some of the Decca tracks, especially the first couple, the singles. I mean, because remember, they were parceled out as singles before they became albums. Sort of like the Christmas singles have been parceled out to us now before we see them as an album some future release year. And I played it for one friend who was a definite Beatles fan, female Beatles fan, but not a collector. And so she listened to the first couple and said, well, I can see why they were turned down. Okay, you're listening to it as a song, as a record. I'm listening to it as a collector. So I'm all excited. And she said, well, that's very nice. Thanks for sharing it. And I don't really, you don't have to get a copy of this. Trust me. I can live without having my own copy of it. So, and I think that's part of the consumer protection approach we decided to take with bootlegs, which was most are not worth buying if you're talking about listening and enjoying Beatles music like you would on all of the canon releases, or with them backing somebody else, producing someone else, appearing on someone else's album. I'd say get those others first, and then since they're bootlegs and since they were stolen, see if you could do what we did, borrow them from somebody and don't buy them, and then just record them and add them to your collection. Now, obviously, the world of bootleg collecting has gone a whole other pathways thanks to the tracking that they did for the video, the guitar game, and all, so that you can play along. And so all of that means those are actually interesting to listen to because you can garner something from that. But frankly, 85th row balcony in a stadium of a live concert of the Beatles is fine to listen to once, and then you don't get all that excited about it afterwards. So that's why that came into the bootleg section as opposed to the formal releases, as opposed to stuff that we would recommend you buy. Again, a long answer.
Yeah. By the third book, you begin talking about specific things like the Black Album of Let It Be.
Oh yeah,
outtakes, and because by then we're talking 1985. That book, the bootleg world has kind of cleaned up quite a lot. So.
And there were records that I was really excited to have in my collection. And I'm going to. This is not breaking news, because I already admitted this at a symposium back in 2014. But one of the things Harry and I did, which I think transformed our attitudes that some bootlegs were worth getting, is through a friend of a friend of a friend of a friend, I honestly don't know who, really, asked if we could do the liner notes for the collection of the Decca tapes. And so that's when we concocted a fictional history of the Decca tapes. And so if you get a copy of all the Decca tapes, and it has liner notes by Grid Leak on the backside, it's a discographer's way of fictionalizing stories. All the discographical information is real catalog numbers, and the dates are real and all. We just change one thing. Decca signs the Beatles. And this is a collection of the unsuccessful releases that they had put out before the Beatles, disappointed at the performance of Decca promoting them, jumped to EMI. And then in the ultimate in cheekiness, before revealing that we were the ones who wrote that, we debunked the liner notes in the third volume, The End of the Beatles. So we were able to do a pretty good job debunking them, since we knew exactly what we had fabricated along the way. So.
Okay, and before I turn you over to Steve, just one other thing I want to point out for people who might run into these books now that we're talking about them, and the Know You're Wrong sections in each one. I mean, those are actually still pretty useful, because there are, although we know that those records aren't the Beatles, there sure was a lot of stuff out there kind of either posing as the Beatles or rumored to be the Beatles or whatever. So what gave you the idea of including that?
Because we kept getting people saying, well, you got to include this and you got to include that. And after we would go through like the British publications, I would say, no, Lord Sitar is not George Harrison. Or when we saw the ad, this wasn't even obscure. It was the ad for the Peter Cook and Dudley Moore Ellis Bumblebee song. I went, okay, that's probably not the Beatles then. So when we had things like that, I said, well, we have to just say it in so many words. This is not the Beatles. And so we had a lot of fun with that. And in the case of the Cook and Moore, I mean, we went backstage when they were performing something called Good Evening, and came up to him and said, do you mind if we ask you this question? And I think Cook was the first one we spoke with. He goes, hey, Dud, a couple of these guys want to ask about the Ellis Bumblebee. Oh, they've heard it? Well, that makes four of us. So it truly was confirmation that we were happy to do, because it was a service. Because, hey, if it was really them, then we wanted the discs.
Yeah.
Okay.
And you had to put something in there about the Mass Marauders, too.
Right.
Oh, I love that. The Mass Marauders was so much fun, especially if you ever picked up the disc. It was the ultimate in fictional supergroups, which was suggested to be everybody under the planet, on the planet that was important. And so we had to talk about that. I created my own Mass Marauders when I was visiting one of the New York Village record stores, where they had the white trash version of, was it Carry That Weight? Yeah. And so they had there's something like John Lennon on it. And I went, I don't think so. And so we started talking, and I said, well, look, if you're going to make the claim, and we started turning it into a Mass Marauders. So we put everyone we could think of on the sleeve that was on the display copy. I think it went from like $50 to $500. And it said something like rumored to include. And I went, fine, do whatever you want. I'm not buying it. But if you're going to go in for a penny, in for many pounds.
Okay. So, Steve?
Well, I too have a lot of questions. In The End of the Beatles, there's a picture of Perion's Beatle books, and it includes You Can't Do That, the big bootleg book.
Oh, yeah.
And As I Write This Letter, which is an interesting piece of history now with letters to the Beatles from fans. But that Things We Said Today book has been something I've referred to so often. It's amazing. I mean, that is such a great book. And I should mention to anybody listening that all three of Wally and Harry's books are available at a relatively reasonable price if you look around in the usual places like Amazon or eBay.
Yeah, and I'm pleased to see that because, we've been talking a lot in detail about the books because we've all seen them. But if someone wants the opportunity to flip through, you can find them at not an unreasonable price. Sometimes I even go shopping for extra copies.
Which is really amazing at this point because a lot of things like that, especially out of print things, go skyrocketing. The prices go skyrocketing. Just for anything. But yeah, they are because I happened to check today, as a matter of fact. So yeah, I think you can get them all for under $15 a piece, and some are a lot less than that. So
do you guys own the rights to them?
Yeah, if we ever wanted to do a reprint and all. And in fact, we've explored doing it a couple times over the decades, but because we would want to retrofit so much about them that it would turn it into a completely different project. Like 2 or 3 times we got kind of far into it and then pulled back. The most recent was when the internet started not the internet, just the whole idea of digital sorting came out. And so Tom Schultheis from then it was Popular Culture Press asked us to consider combining them all into some kind of digital disc reference work. But we were a little bit ahead of where the technology was, and I came in with all of these requests of triple cross-referencing. No, it can't do that yet. So you can't just click on this title and have it go 12 other places. Because that's the way you'd love to do it digitally. Right. So, but yeah, we have the rights, but it would just be you'd have to definitely renegotiate all the picture rights because it's a different world now for such things. But the data, sure. Unfortunately, all of this was written pre-computer, which means we'd have to retype all of the data, or probably scan it and then fix up the scans, optical character recognition. But it would be a massive project, and Harry said, well, given the choice between updating our Watching TV book and updating these Beatle books, I'm going to go with the Watching TV books. Those lawyers, they always focus on things that are so much more practical.
Wally, how long did it, the fundamental question is how long did it take you to do all 3 books, and especially the first book? When did you conceive the first book, and when did the first book come out?
Oddly, it took years but months. Namely, Harry and I spent years together at WNUR, at Northwestern, and we met as freshmen and started swapping Beatles information back then. And Harry had the first draft by hand of sorting the Beatles material into some kind of list. And that's where he came up with the highlighting things that had been previously issued to make it stand out as you look from one disc to another. You can see, all right, there's only 4 new tracks on this. All the rest are reissues. And we defined reissue as being something that had previously come out in the U.S. and after a significant amount of time then came out in the U.K. or vice versa. So not simultaneous releases, but stuff that they plucked these tracks and put them elsewhere. So he had those working notes, and we used them on and off on projects together throughout our college days together.
What years are we talking about?
That would have been in the 71 to 75 range.
Okay.
And so a pretty rich time to be looking at solo efforts. In fact, if you ask me to name my favorite Beatles years, apart from the obvious group years, that period of like 72, 71, 72, 73, 74, a little bit of bleed into 75 would be my favorite Beatles years because there were so many strong solo releases. And so it was fun chronicling them, and he kept his notes going for that as well. So that became the basis of our book pitch. We then just had to translate it into typeface because you're not going to sell a handwritten set of notes to any kind of publisher unless the handwriter is Bob Dylan.
So it was handwritten when you gave it to Piran?
Oh no. We showed it to Piran saying this is what we're going to do, and then they said, well, here's the typewriter. It was a composer. And that we so I personally typed because I'm a better typist than Harry. I personally typed every page in
Oh my
Altogether
God.
Now. We typed camera ready copy in the days before digital, which means if you made a mistake, there was a lot of work involved in correcting the mistakes.
Right. Oh my God. Oh my God. And so when you gave it to Period, you didn't have it on computer disc, right? So
Nope.
wow.
There was a box of camera ready on a certain type of paper that they would then turn around and send to the printer. There were however many hundred pages were there. We did them.
Yeah, I understand camera ready. Number one, from having worked in the newspaper business, but also my father was a printer, and
Sure.
he had his own print shop, and that's what he did. And yeah, I understand that, and it was especially in the days before computer when my parents first opened their shop. My mother would type on a IBM Selectric, and that's the way they did it, and so it was. It was crazy. I mean, before computers, it was absolutely nuts. And I can't imagine you typing all these numbers and things by hand. I mean, that must have drove you. Again, how long did it take you to type all that stuff up?
Okay. So basically, I said it took us several years, namely basically the time of our college careers, undergrad college careers, to assemble the information. Add to that another, say, year or so in the Washington, D.C., New York corridor. And so, but the typing, basically, that was just a couple months.
Really?
I think it was only 2 months. And then it was just going through the processing that was necessary for, doing a completed book. I'll tell you what I hated.
What?
Maybe It's You dash Hal David dash Burt Bacharach dash Barney Williams dash running time. Oh, let's do that again on another reissue. Oh, let's do that on another reissue. Burt Russell dash Phil Medley slash. Oh, here's Hal David again. And so there were some of those that, especially the Tony Sheridan tracks, where I don't want to see those names again.
The other thing that is just really astounding especially about Altogether Now, but again, all three books, is the amount of data that you and you were talking about this earlier, the data you had, and there was no, at least as I can recall, the communication with the record companies today is a lot different than it was back then. I mean, there was basically no communication with the record companies. I'm assuming you did this all on your own. So you gathered all of that information for each individual release on your own, correct?
Mostly. There are a couple of exceptions. There were some actually very nice people in Apple Los Angeles. And so we would keep our questions very, very focused. And there was one helpful person that I said, look, we're looking at this John Lennon rock and roll, and we have no idea. Could you give us some kind of hint as to who was involved in this? And much to my amazement, we get a call a couple of days later. Well, I can't give it to you by track, but here are the people that were at the sessions. Okay, we'll take that. We'll take that information. But mostly, yes, it was us checking every available resource. You got to remember, though, this is where our time at the college radio station helped, because there was a lot more information than you would think put in the press releases and what have you as each record would come out, especially the four others releases. So I still have, I think it's like a 12-page press release with the first David Bromberg album that gives you anecdotes about how these songs came together, including the song George Harrison wrote called The Hold Up. So there was information, and because we had been in the industry, so to speak, at just the right time, we were able to snatch a lot of that, and that went into our personal files as we departed the radio station.
Because that's the real amazing part of the books, is the exhaustive amount of information you gathered. You know, again, pre-computer. I mean, that I mean, that's miraculous as far as I'm concerned.
And that was one of the reasons I mentioned also the Rodgers and Hammerstein collection at the New York Public Library, Lincoln Center branch, is they had some wonderful gramophone catalogs. There were these catalogs of, I think, particular of the single that never was from Wildlife. It was listed in the gramophone catalog and assigned a number and all. Because I'm just flipping through lists and went, oh, I hadn't seen that before. Let me drop that in. Well, it never came out, but it was assigned a number. Mm-hmm. So far in the process that it actually made a distributed to the public, granted a very specialized public, namely the record store industry, but it was real as far as they were concerned. And so, yeah, we checked any kind of, if it lived and breathed as an official industry catalog, we were there. You know, the old phonologues that used to be in every record store. Well, I had friends who were at record stores who said, I've saved you the pages. Or, you know, as we've gotten rid of old pages, I put them on this pile for you. Or I would camp out at a friend's, I knew the owner of a store, and I would camp out for a day just flipping, just looking to see, not even for anything in particular, but what it wouldn't occur to me to ask about, I would find in there. A lot of times it would be reissues too, like, oh, so there's the reissue number there. Oh, those are singles that never made the charts because all they are repackagings of such and such singles. So yeah, we looked for first-hand information as often as we could, both on the consumer level and on a limited extent on the industry level as well.
You were talking about Peter Cook and Dudley Moore. I was looking down the acknowledgments in the front of All Together now, right just now, and a couple of names popped out: Neil Aspinall, Ray Coleman, and Peter Cook and Dudley Moore, and also where's the other one? Richard Perry Productions, Lennon Music, and there was one more here. I'm flipping through. Oh, Tony King. How did I mean the Neil Aspinall name and Mal Evans? Those two names especially imply that there was some direct help from the Beatles. Was there any at all?
Oh, not from the Beatles. No. Okay. It would be questions to either their publishers, their publicists. Now, in the case of Mal Evans, it was actually a conversation with him. I said, look, we've reached this point where we don't know if this is true or not. Could you tell us? And it took weeks, but we finally got a phone number and a phone connection to him in Los Angeles, you know, before his tragic death. And just said, no, that's not true. Yes, that is true. I was there. Yes, that is true. No, that isn't true. And it was just because he would know. He was there.
Right.
For Melody Maker, Ray Coleman, he chuckled at it years later. He was the one who signed the letter that gave us the permission to reproduce the Melody Maker charts. And I said, oh, Ray, I wanted to show you something that you sent us years ago when he was speaking at a Beatles convention. And he goes, oh, yeah, well, that's me. Okay, well, I'm glad it worked for you. So it wasn't a personal connection, but it was an official connection in that we did have to get those clearances. And the same with reaching out to the likes of Neil Aspinall. And some of those credits came through the publisher, Period Press, who also did some outreach to get permissions for some of the material, mostly images that we were using.
I was also going to ask you, because another really interesting and really very useful thing in all of the books is the chart information. And you mentioned Ray Coleman in with NME and was it Melody Maker? I'm sorry.
Melody Maker, yeah.
Yeah, and then you have Billboard. I mean, did you have what was involved in getting all that chart information? Because that is really exhaustive considering.
Oh, actually, the chart information from Billboard was the first thing Harry and I ever did. Because there were bound volumes of Billboard at Northwestern University.
But did you compile that stuff yourself, or did they give it to you all compiled?
Yeah, because we had to compile it ourselves because of our definition of what counted as a Beatles release. Because if you said, oh, could you give us the Beatles chart information? Well, they wouldn't necessarily have Mary Hopkin produced by Paul.
Right.
They wouldn't necessarily have George is on this Cream record because that's not according to the parameters that they would define as a Beatles release. So it was us looking for what we considered part of the story. And so therefore the only people who could do it would be us, because we knew exactly what we were looking for and were determined to keep the run as consecutive as possible. In fact, I love the fact that by counting things like History of Eric Clapton, Tommy with Ringo doing a guest vocal, Approximately Infinite Universe, we really do extend how long a chart run the Beatles had on Billboard's charts, because those kind of cover when basically sometime in New York City drops off. So from October of 1972 to January to April of 1973, there actually are no Beatles albums on the charts, solo or otherwise. But by having all of these four others in our tracking, it's an uninterrupted flow from 1964 to the end of the book, which I think it just looks more impressive
right.
when you say that.
And you said there were a bunch of pages cut out of the end of the Beatles. Do those still exist?
I was looking for them the other month. They're probably in some box somewhere because they got to the point of typesetting. I mean, it wasn't just here's a draft. It was, I get this note from Tom Schulte. I said, then it was Popular Culture Press, said, you got to cut out about 100 pages from this. And so I cut out Dark Horse Revisited, Ringo Records Revisited, Apple Revisited, the films, Apple Music Publishing. Oh my God, talk about self-indulgent in a way, but just the type of thing that collectors would love. Long before we started getting these definitive histories of Apple, because of the Library of Congress, I had all of these Apple publishing credits that covered multiple pages, and it's like those have got to go by the wayside because it's too many pages. So now I've created the unpublished The End of the Beatles archive deluxe edition potential. It's sitting there somewhere in some box, somewhere in my basement shelves. But I haven't seen that for a very long time. I just remember being kind of bummed out. I'm like, but they're already typeset. We haven't even indexed them yet, he reminded me.
Because I'm sitting here thinking, even if you don't put the books out again, it would be great to have that lost information.
Things like that. Yeah, because in particular, Dark Horse had some interesting releases UK only. Ringo's record certainly did. And the whole publishing world, Apple Music Publishing, is truly its own story, though I think that's been covered pretty well as of late. But for the longest time, it's like, wow, this is Apple. Right, it's Apple before there was Apple, so to speak.
Right.
Apple before there was Apple Records.
Well, I'm just saying for historical purposes, I think it would be great to have that stuff, that you guys did, so you can get credit for, it. Maybe even, if you were to do it, by maybe computer disc or something.
Yeah.
Some way, somehow, but make PDFs out of it or whatever. But it would be great to have that, even if it's, it is what it is. But I think it would be great to have. So. Ken, back to you.
To look in my shelves.
Okay.
But not immediately.
Okay. Go ahead, Ken.
I actually wanted to ask you a few questions about the charts because as far as Billboard is concerned, you actually have week by week where the albums and singles were placed on the charts as opposed to, say, Joel Whitburn's books that came out later on, which told you where the songs peaked. Although later on he also put out books which was week by week. Were there any clearance issues with Billboard as far as that's concerned?
We sent Billboard exactly what we were going to put in the book. Said, can we put this in? And they said, yeah. Now, you notice that we don't have Billboard charts in the subsequent volumes because they came back and said, well, on second thought, maybe that's not what we would ideally like to have as the arrangement. And so it was fine what we did. But, and we were absolutely upfront because, like I said, we had it already. I mean, it's like, this is what we've researched. This is the form it takes. We need your permission to include it. And so they said it was okay. But then when we returned to them for the subsequent volumes, they said, we'll take a pass on it this time. I think because that gets awfully close to almost reproducing the chart as opposed to summarizing what the individual chart history is. Like, it peaked at this, it was on the chart for 6 weeks, this was the low point, this was the high point, here were the dates, but you never actually look at the chart. And what we did is we basically did mini charts that followed the thread of just those records. It was fine, it was approved, but just for the altogether now, not for the subsequent volumes.
Yeah, it was so much fun to watch these charts that way because you saw what records were on simultaneously. And as one song went down the charts, one went up the charts, and you had this side project, you had this Peter and Gordon song, or you had this Cream release, like you were saying. So, and also about Melody Maker, you kind of answered the question about Ray Coleman giving permission. But sometimes when you look at reference books, when it comes to the British charts, they go by the British Music Research Bureau, which is a combination of, it's an average of, they had 4 different charts in England. How do you decide? And for that matter, there may be some people who are not Billboard fans in America either. They could have, you could have gone with Cashbox. Yeah. So how do you decide between Billboard and Melody Maker?
Billboard was easy. To us, that was the official. But for Melody Maker, Harry and I went back and forth on whether it was going to be New Musical Express or Melody Maker, and what finally determined it is there was a run of issues of New Musical Express that the Library of Congress did not have. So the only charts we had from beginning to end were for Melody Maker. But Harry was tracking New Musical Express, I was tracking Melody Maker, and we were both lobbying for our respective news publication. But it was not any kind of combination. It wasn't Record Retailer. It wasn't any of those. It was, because remember, our context was these are news reporting entities, and this is the chart that they had as part of their news reporting. So we wanted to reproduce that. We don't want some after-the-fact analysis of what it was. We want the fact that the headline of Melody Maker could say, the Beatles at number 3! Exclamation point. Uh-oh, what happened here? So, I mean, they took those charts seriously, at least certainly through the mid-'60s. When you get into the 70s era, it's like, oh, we used to do headlines like that? Oh, okay. But it was serious business back then, and it was another entree into the British reporting of pop music. Remember, there was no Rolling Stone for us to be looking at, and even the early Rolling Stones were more essays as opposed to news articles.
Yeah. Also, I'm a big fan of side projects of the Beatles, and it all started with All Together Now. And I'm sure that you realize that that book helped to give birth to the Chris Engelhardt books of Deep Undercover. So, and for the information that you got from that, you were saying you used Beatle Book, which I guess you mean Beatle Monthly, right?
Yeah, Beatle Monthly, yeah.
Okay. I would think that must have been like the best source for that kind of information, but that's got to be the toughest thing to assemble because there's always the chance that something slipped through the cracks that you didn't know about. So how do you keep on top of that other than a few references that you used?
That's where we were lucky for All Together Now in that we were able to capture most of the stuff, certainly from the 60s, because these were British news publications, and so they cared. I mean, they cared the same way that a fan would care. Now, a British news publication in 1976 would not have cared anywhere near as much. I think it was NME that in reviewing the Love Songs album said, I'll give my review copy of this to the first person who writes in and tells me what was so great about this group in the first place. So, there was definitely a different attitude then. But at the time in the 60s, they would be just as eager as we fans would be to make sure they captured that news. Having said that, yeah, we knew stuff was going to slip behind the cracks. So one time talking once with Harry Nilsson in one of his more lucid moments, and I was specifically asking him about the Flash Harry album and all, and he said, "So what are you doing this for?" And I was explaining that it was the continuation of this All Together Now project and on all the stuff that the Beatles had been associated with. And he goes, "Oh, you'll never get it all. There's so much cleaning up the language stuff that they've done that no one knows about." Okay, well, anytime you want to tell me, just let me know. And there have been some that have been frustrating dead ends. Like, was this person associated with John Lennon during his New York City days or not? Or did they just hang out, but nothing was ever committed to record? And so, yeah, we took as a given that there would be a small percentage that we just would never know. We would never. In fact, something just came out this past couple weeks. I was listening to the Peter Asher series, and he talked about the single he produced, which was "And the Sun Will Shine."
Right.
And,
Paul Jones.
Oh, right, Paul Jones. And we had the B-side as not associated with Paul. And in a couple episodes ago, he said, "Oh, and then on the other side, with Paul also on drums, we recorded The Dog Presides." All right, so that's something that we could only find out from the producer. Probably not Paul, because would he even remember that detail? But the producer, Peter Asher, would remember that detail. So that's a perfect example of there was no source that would have gone into that detail about that session, saying that he was also on the B-side. So there's still stuff to be found. And now I want that. That's one of the singles I don't have. I've tried over the years myself to acquire it, and I lost out on an auction bid for it. So
you can hear that song on YouTube.
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, but if I wanted to physically have it,
right.
That's what's also made it kind of interesting about All Together Now and the other two volumes take on a different role now than they did originally. Before it was, what do I need to look for? Now, in a YouTube world, it's, where did this come from? And so it gives you a context for this music that you don't get from a YouTube, or if you do, it might not be accurate context. And I can't tell you the number of times I'm reading the comments notes and going, "I'm not going to respond, I'm not going to comment, totally wrong," but it won't make any difference because in this internet world, my word equals the same as everyone else's word, so don't get involved. Don't get involved.
Well, there's an obvious question that I have to ask you, and that is, did you ever consider doing a fourth book from the end of the Beatles, which was the third book, took you through 1983? Did you want to continue after that?
I did. Actually, as I said, Harry was a little less interested, so I thought I would jumpstart it by taking it on as a solo project. And so I was working with Popular Culture Press for something called Strange Days, the music of John, Paul, George, and Ringo 20 years on. I did a couple of article pieces for it. In fact, a couple of them ended up in Beatle Fan, I think. And then other things came around. I said, I need a collaborator. I can't do this solo, because this is the type of detail work that you need to bounce it off of someone else. And so that just quietly died, except it made a couple of Popular Culture Press's listings of forthcoming books, which is fine. There are books that are announced and never come out all the time. But it also got a 5-star review on Amazon, the book that never came out, and also got referenced in a guide to Beatles or guide to rock books, and it was listed positively as well. And I didn't know that until my next door neighbor came up to me with a printout and said, "How can I find this? I've been trying to order it and no one has it." And I looked, "What are you talking about?" Oh, No, it never came out. Well, it had to have come out. It got 5 stars. I later found out it was a friend of mine who put he said, well, if Wally wrote it, it must be good. And so he gave it 5 stars. And that's the closest we got. I didn't actually even consider using the leftover cutouts from the end of the Beatles, which I probably should have. That would have given it a real jump start. And I just wanted to continue the chronicling. But by then, like I said, it was too much else was going on. And also, the experience has been changing. Once you started going from vinyl to vinyl CD, by the way, we never considered cassettes real. I mean, anything that you can erase inadvertently, demagnetize, that's not a release. So that's why we never counted cassettes in our chronology, nor reel to reel. So once we started getting into CDs, it's like, all right, now we're getting alternate mixes, or at least renewally mixed. What do we do with that? Is that considered a different release? I don't want to deal with it. It didn't become fun anymore. It was something that would be too burdensome to do. Because I actually tried a couple of versions of how do you deal with the CD, quote, is it a reissue? Is it a reissued box set? Well, then you don't do all the contents, except it's a little bit different. And we just never wanted to go into that kind of detail. And especially since Harry wasn't interested in collaborating on that, I didn't want to do all those discussions with myself. I would have driven myself crazy.
Yeah, it gets far more complicated once you get into the reissues and the remasters and how does it all count? So,
can I interject something here? Strange Days is also listed in the Popular Music Teaching Handbook by Beely Cooper and Rebecca Condon. I'm looking at an ebook. It's on Google Books. I'm looking at an ebook of it right now, and it's listed in there. It's
by me?
Yeah, by you. No, the reason I found it is because you were talking about the book, and I decided to see what would turn up in Google, and there it is. It's listed there. Let me see what page it is. It's on page 118. 118. There it is at the bottom. It says it's right below Gareth Pawlowski's How They Became the Beatles. It says Walter J. Podrazik, Strange Days, the music of John, Paul, George, and Ringo, 20 years on, 1988.
And that goes back to Know You're Wrong.
Yeah.
Really, Know You're Wrong.
Speaking of Know You're Wrong, I had a question. In the first book, you talk about bootlegs, and you mentioned Peace of Mind, which of course was not real. But do you know anything? Have you heard anything? That's the one song that I would love to know where it came from. Have you ever heard anything about the origin of that thing?
I don't think so. Because it is a weird song.
Right.
I mean, calling it a song is even being too kind.
Yeah, probably.
But not really. And you see, we're in a really I know you led with news about people passing on. You also mentioned Engelhardt's book about Undercover and all. We're rapidly coming to the point at which the only people that could identify these are disappearing, because you will not get an official record company file that you can crack open and identify. So that's why I think all the work that Mark Lewison is doing in terms of just every source that he could find is so important, because it's sort of the last attempt to cull information while some of the principles are still alive.
Right.
No, I don't have any further information. And the more time that intervenes, the less likely it is we're going to find out. Unless you have an out-of-the-blue thing like Peter Asher saying, oh, by the way, and then the B-side Paul was on too.
Okay.
But that's how you're going to find it. Or from folks like you, when you all have your followings and your discussion postings and all, is someone who might have worked for someone who talked with someone could at least say, here's a place to look.
Because I've never even heard a lead on this thing. Alan, have you?
I haven't either.
Yeah, people have said it was a Pink Floyd outtake, actually.
That's what they've said, but you know, I think that's kind of, I don't know that there's any legitimacy to that.
Sometimes there's projection. It should be,
Yeah.
but that doesn't mean
Right.
it is.
Yeah, I don't think it doesn't seem to sound like Pink Floyd to me.
I know it's early Ruddles.
Pre-Ruddles.
Pre-Ruddles.
Pre-Fab Ruddles. Yeah. But anyway.
Incidentally, I should say that as far as the Mass Marauders are concerned, there actually was a piece on CBS News on television. It ran for almost 10 minutes about the whole history of it.
Oh, great.
They actually devoted a piece on that, which you can find on YouTube, by the way. Yeah, how it all started with an article, a review in Rolling Stone, and people believed it was really the Beatles, and they were calling up stores asking, how can I find this? And, it's really interesting. I guess the fact that they actually devoted time to that.
It actually had
and it charted, too,
I don't know if it charted, but it had Bay Area ties. The group that was involved was in the Bay Area. And I'm on, by the way, I am on Amazon right now. You can buy the complete DVD recordings, is what they call it, for $9.99, which is actually pretty damn cheap. In fact, I think I'm gonna get one right now. But seriously, because it comes with, and on the Amazon it comes with auto rip. I had a vinyl copy of it and it got stolen from me years ago, and I haven't had it since. And I love that album. I mean, that was just great. So.
Did it really sound like the Beatles?
You never heard it? Oh, it's probably on YouTube. Kind of. Actually, it was more like Jagger because the lead track was called, and I'm sorry if I offend anybody. The lead track was called "I Can't Get No Nookie."
Yes, I remember that.
So, and it sounded like Jagger. I mean, or kind of sounded like Jagger, But it was hilarious, and that was what was so great about that set. I don't know. It sounded like the Beatles. I think there was some Dylan. There was a Dylan imitator too. But as far as the Beatles go, they were not, as I recall, they were not well represented in terms of imitators on there. So it was basically, I think, Jagger and Dylan being imitated. Is that what you guys remember? Alan, you remember that?
Yeah, I do. In fact, I have a copy.
Anyway,
okay.
I just want to say, Wally, without my realizing it, I think Altogether Now had more of an influence on me than probably any Beatle book. Only because of the fact that whereas there are a lot of people in this world who look at the Beatles as though it's 1962 to 1970, cut, that's it. Your book opened up my eyes to all these other things. Certainly with the side projects and the Apple recordings, which I probably would have discovered anyway. But the fact that there's so much more to the Beatles than just what they did as a band. And obviously there's a lot in there as a band, but it just continued. And to me, the Beatles, when you say the Beatles, it represents everything all four of them have ever done, whether it's together or on their own. And your books really illustrate that for me. So that's all I wanted to say.
Well, thank you.
Well, and I also have to say that, I mean, and I think I speak for a lot of people. I mean, they were and there still are. I mean, they were incredibly invaluable, and you guys did an incredible job. I mean, we've basically been telling you that, but let's make it clear. I mean, they're great books. They're fantastic, and you guys were pioneers. So.
Well, I greatly appreciate that, and it gladdens our hearts that people got the theme of looking for more music than just what's on the official canon, which, by the way, is excellent to have. It's just there's so much more.
Right. All right, so we're going to close by giving our folks contact information for each one of us, and we'll start with you, Steve.
My email address is BeatlesExaminer@gmail.com. I have my own Facebook page, which is personal and goes on more than music. But for Beatles stuff, Beatle News and Information is the group. And there's also a group for the show, Things We Said Today, Beatles Radio Fans. You can write us at Things We Said Today Radio Show @gmail.com. We're on Twitter at Things We Said Fab. There's a second Things We Said Today page on Facebook that's for the Fab 4 Radio broadcasts on the weekends, on Saturday and Sunday. I think that's about it as far as the show goes. But by all means, contact us. You can download us on Podbean, on TuneIn Radio. We're in a number of places, and you can stream us on YouTube. So there we go. We're everywhere.
Okay. Alan, how about you?
The easiest way to get to me is through Facebook, either through Alan Kozin or Alan Kozin Remixed.
Okay. And Wally, I know you have your own website.
Yeah, it's mediawally.com, or you could send an email to wally@watchingtv.org.
Okay. And as for me, Ken Michaels, you can write to me at my email address, which is everylittlething@att.net. I also have a Facebook page for Ken Michaels, and my website is kenmichaelsradio.com. Visit the website every day for Beatles trivia, and you can win one of 9 prizes every single week and listen to very interesting interviews with some of the same people that we interview on this show. Again, that's kenmichaelsradio.com. Wally, this has been absolutely fantastic. It is so great having you here on the show. And thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation. I enjoyed it as well.
Okay. And for Alan Kozin, Steve Marinucci, and Wally Podrazik, this is Ken Michaels thanking you all for listening. And we will see you next time.